follow for Q&A, and the session is also being recorded for those unable to attend this morning for reasons known to us due to events on Canterbury over the weekend and tomorrow. So, Brad, we'll get across to you.
Awesome. Kia ora and good morning, everyone. It is lovely to be here. As I said before, it is my first time on the coast, and it is lovely to finally get here. It's been on my bucket list for a wee while, and COVID, like probably many others, has forced me to get out and explore the country a bit more, which I'm certainly enjoying doing. I do have to give apologies for Infometrics Senior Economist Nick Brunson, who would be here, but has managed to get taken down with a cold. He tells me it's not COVID, which is good. But in precaution of that, he's not flown over this morning, which I think is the right move. What I want to do for you for the next sort of 40, 45 odd minutes is highlight what we're seeing across the national economy to start with, just to sort of see where the West Coast sits amongst all of the changes we're seeing nationally, and then also focusing a little bit on some of the work that Infometrics has done for Westland District Council around the LTP forecasts and assumptions and such. I'll share a presentation now, and then we'll do some questions towards the end. Perfect. All right. To start with is sort of some of the major trends that we're seeing across New Zealand, and one of the surprising ones has been how the job market has evolved. We were expecting, and certainly we were concerned, that we would see quite a fall in employment, and at one point businesses themselves were telling us when we aggregated all of it up that we could see 300,000 fewer jobs across the country, which was a pretty scary prospect in mid-2020. The actual eventuation of that hasn't come through, and instead we've seen that the labour market remains in an all right position. Unemployment is at 4.7%, not good in a sense. It's still 7.7 percentage points higher than pre-COVID, but it's also not 10%, which is again where the fears and the forecasts were earlier in time. And you can see coming through as well that the number of people on a job seeker support benefit across the country is trending down. Now that's always a reassuring sign, particularly when it's now below, if you will, the peaks that we saw during 2020. So you can see that the 2 points, I guess, to draw your attention to is that one, the green line's now below the blue line. That's reassuring, but there's also a distance to go before we fill this gap back in and get lots more people back into work. The struggle at the moment does seem to be how we take this pool of people in the green and actually enable them to get back into the workplace. We know that a number of businesses are looking for more workers, but actually matching up the skills that these people have on JobSeeker and what businesses are looking for remains quite difficult. We're also seeing that there's been quite a change and an interesting shift in trend, if you will, across the country. If we look at the job seeker numbers in the North Island, you can see that most parts, apart from Hawke's Bay, Gisborne, and very slightly Manawatu, has actually seen that their job seeker numbers have gotten worse continually. So they're still moving through the motions of this COVID-19 pandemic. Whereas you look at the South Island and you can see that actually there's a bit more coming back when it comes to further growth in the number of job seekers. And you can see it increasingly, even for the likes of the West Coast, you've got a small increase, sure, but a lot smaller than what you see again across the North Island. And interestingly, you see quite a large boost further in the likes of Canterbury. So the reason I highlight this is because not all groups and not all areas are feeling the hit the same way. Some sort of were hit hard and immediately and are now starting on that recovery journey. Others were hit hard but are continuing to be hit harder as we move into 2021, not sort of the same pace for all areas. That's similar as well when we look at where job numbers are coming through across the country. If we look at the top areas, health, construction and public administration, not too many surprises in a sense. It is a health pandemic. That's always reassuring that our health numbers are going up. We're training up vaccinators. We're bringing nurses back into the fold. We need to make sure we've got capacity in our health system.
Great. Sorry, we get a copy of this later?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'll make sure you get a copy of the slides. Construction's also reassuring to see. We know across the country we've got some pretty substantial housing issues. We've got to build more of the damn things, and that requires some labourers on the ground. So we're seeing that the number of builders, fitter turners, electricians, the lot are still going up. And then the government has come to the party with some stimulus, deciding that they'd rather do it in-house than anything else, and increasing the number of people employed in the public administration side. Particularly, we've seen rises in the likes of MSD. Of course, they're doing more work brokerage and similar, but just as importantly, we've seen rises in some of the work that MB's done, they're doing managed isolation now, and Ōranga Tamariki are also expanding their operations. So there's a bit of a shift on with government wanting to expand their services. The other end of the spectrum, again, not too many surprises there, the likes of transport, so code for Air New Zealand in a main sense, along with the likes of accommodation and food services, quite hard hit. Admin and support services is interesting for two reasons. The first is that that's where travel agents sit, so again, not too surprising. But also, even outside of travel agents, we've seen a decline in that total admin and support service role, which highlights that although businesses aren't themselves sort of closing or laying off huge numbers of workers, they're also not going out for quite as much support as they used to. And so there's this feeling that businesses are keeping their costs a little bit tighter and closer to their chest, not going out and asking or buying in as much support. Looking across the regions, we see an interesting shift starting from the bottom, if you will. Otago quite clear there with their hit to international tourism. And I think that is the big thing, is that they did have not only such a tourism focus, but such an international tourism focus. And that really has hit their capacity as they've moved forward. The likes of Marlborough slightly down as well. Auckland and Southland, two of the other larger tourism regions, certainly with the focus on international tourism. You can see the West Coast very slightly up there, and I'll get back to some of those numbers later. The other end of the spectrum, we see the likes of the Waikato coming through quite firmly, along with Penny and Manawatu. Very strong primary sector throughout all of those areas, coupled with not as much exposure to tourism generally. So it's not just that they're strong primary, as they also don't have that downside risk from the tourism, loss of tourism activity. Wellington, well, I told you about those public service jobs. That certainly helped them as they move forward. Not everything's still going all right, and we're seeing that spending activity, which is a pretty good indicator of where people are at, showing some interesting trends. Now, the major one, I guess, for this room is these bars in the middle. And what it shows is that there was quite a steep fall in spending in the West Coast over the first 2 months of the year relative to normal levels, and that's the international dip. Yeah. What's more reassuring, I guess, is that you can see a good, 3.5% growth relative to 2019 levels for the last 3 months. And it does reiterate that things have become a bit better. We have had population growth in that time and what have you, but those numbers do reiterate that things are in a slightly rosy position. Notwithstanding the point that, as we talked about before, these months that we're starting to move into are always sort of, much lower activity anyway. So we're comparing lower activity to lower activity, but it's not falling further. And I think that's reassuring in terms of businesses sort of not leaking too much more. They've managed to plug as many holes as they can. You see that as well if you look at the likes of Auckland and Otago, down, but again, getting better over the last few months. And again, at the top end of the spectrum, that spending activity starting to come through more strongly than what was there over summer. Now, part of that is because the vaccine rollout has started to get moving, and probably importantly, businesses and households are also feeling more confident about the future than we might have expected last year. So they are keen still to get out there and spend a bit more money. We haven't seen a complete collapse in domestic tourism. And I say that in the sense that there was a concern that we'd do a big amount of spending last year. People would spend through all of their saved up funds and then maybe not do too much. But that general confidence in the economy does mean that, again, we're seeing an improvement generally in that recovery speed. And importantly, you can see that actual spending activity relative to 2019 levels in the last few months is actually up slightly if you look towards the edge of that slide, which is important because, look, yes, there was a big big drop in lockdown, but overall it's actually quite hard in a sense to see the complete loss of $17 billion worth of international tourism, which highlights that we're seeing that still strong continued support from our local economy. We are, however, travelling New Zealand differently on aggregate, and we're expecting that remains for a while. And I'll take the Mayor's comments around his hope that things get better. I'm probably more pessimistic personally, but I'm happy to have that conversation later on. Our expectations, which are in line with government expectations as well, is that we're likely to see an opening, some sort of further opening to border conditions into 2022. Every hope, if you will, was that it would be the start of 22. Given that we're quite slow in rolling out the vaccine, it seems like it might be pushed out a little bit. But in our minds, it still takes a while to get that international tourism level back up considerably. A major challenge there just being the capacity to bring people in from overseas, and noting that although New Zealand's done all right through the pandemic, other parts of the world haven't, and so households might be a little bit more skitterish about travelling back. You can see that we still have, numbers going back to about 2 million or so by 2023. It's just that it is a hard slog to recover everything. However, the government's focus on, if you will, the level of spending rather than the number of people may well offset some of that, because we're looking just at numbers here. We're also seeing that people are keen on doing a bit of a roading still across the country. My family's probably quite a good example of that. Again, I'm a Northlander, my first time on the coast. They'd never really been to much of the South Island themselves. Took 2 weeks out last year and drove around the country from, I think, came over and Picton and sort of did the entire loop around the South Island. So we are seeing that people are still looking to do a bit more of that. Overall, the areas that are performing best across the country, tourism-wise, are those that are often close to major urban centres. They are there's sort of more more drive-based than fly-based touring, and a lot of that is just generally the convenience, flexibility, and often the cost. Kiwis are generally cheap, at least relative to international tourists, so we're still seeing a trend there. If we look at how well New Zealand's recovered, we've still seen that Air New Zealand's domestic flying numbers are still down 14% even in March, and things are getting pretty good at that point, averaging I think about a quarter down normally across the last few months before that. And because of it, again, we're seeing a very different spend trend across the country. Again, the bottom of the screen highlights that hard hit over the last 6 months to a number of our RTO areas. At the other end of the spectrum, there's sort of two trends that are worthwhile profiling there. The first one is that Tairāwhiti Gisborne, well, they had basically no international tourism, so they lost nothing in a sense and have gained a bit more, particularly over summer. If you then look at the other areas, you start to see some clear trends in terms of Wellingtonians heading to the Wairarapa, Christchurch heading over to Hammer Springs and Kurunui, Aucklanders heading to the Coromandel, and Palmy dwellers heading over to Wanganui often. And so again, those trends are that we're seeing a greater focus on some of those drive-based locations. Northland would look better apart from the Auckland lockdowns being that no one's drive through, so their tourism got hit a little bit harder than they might have expected. The big shift we're seeing at the moment still remains that there's a fast pace of change coming through. I think we are in 2021 able to take a bit more of a breath compared to where we were last year. Last year you were running on adrenaline for 365 days. This time around there's a bit more of an ability to be proactive rather than reactive, but we're still seeing that those organisations and groups that are moving forward at pace and not really letting things lie are able to get the best results. Those who sort of stop to take a breath in a sense, finding it hard to regain that momentum when everything is shifting just so quickly. We're also seeing a big shift in terms of a new way of working. Kiwis are spending much more time at home these days than ever before. And that doesn't seem to be abating, even though COVID-19 is not actually a thing out in the community. You can see from the spending trends in the graph that the likes of home and recreational spending, so that's stuff on not only sort of home renos and similar, but also the likes of electronics and at-home goods. Basically, everyone's buying a couch and maybe a new TV and Xbox bits and pieces. And it is because if you're going to spend longer at home, you want to make it a good experience. Related to that, because people are spending longer at home, they're also not popping out quite as much food, and therefore they're spending on our food and liquor, so your grocery store elements, still holding up relatively well. You can see in terms of accommodation, it's trended back up over recent months, but again, still in a much softer position. It's also the way we're travelling as well. Talking to organisations around the country, it's quite clear that higher end accommodation is not doing quite as well, apart from those who might be doing MIQ. But I remember talking to some people over the summer, and they said, look, my hotel's just pretty bare for a lot of them. At the same time, the head of the Holiday Parks Association told me that he had no more room in any of the places he was talking to. So again, New Zealanders are travelling, they're just travelling quite differently.
Brad, do you have any take out of that accommodation as to where the balance is between holiday accommodation and business accommodation?
Generally speaking, it's quite firmly holiday. Business stuff is not trending back quite as much. It depends a little bit on who you talk to. I feel like I've seen some statements that reckon that business travel is just, really roaring back. I've seen absolutely no evidence of that, particularly in corporate service town Wellington, which is a pretty good bellwether for that. There is a bit more coming in, but certainly speaking to accommodation providers, weekend stuff is good, which is often your travellers. Your weekday stuff certainly still a bit weaker on the whole, and it is because the likes of this, Zoom is very much allowing business activity to happen a bit more remotely on the whole. I mean, there is some coming back, but what we're seeing as well, the likes of the Trans-Tasman bubble is a good example of this, is that there's three sort of broad types of travellers, if you will: family and friend travellers, business travellers, and tourists. Family and friends are quite strong. They've been coming back quite hardcore. There's a bit of tourism coming through, and we expect that to move ahead with the likes of the ski season coming up. Business travel is there, but nowhere near the levels that we previously saw it. Even overall, total travel movements from Australia into New Zealand only sitting at about 30% of usual 2019 levels. So we've got a bit back, sure, but it's not going anywhere fast. Probably important to note as well that 30% has plateaued. So we had an immediate burst coming through, and it's not gone any higher than that. So it very much seems to be a bit of a limit there in terms of people's own ability or willingness to travel. And I know that the airlines also had to scale back some of their expectations around flight movements and some of it. So there's more, it's just still a little bit hairy to pull through. If we look at, again, this working from home trend, you can see that the major urban centres doing relatively rubbish compared to other areas. Now, there's a lot of lines on that screen. The one I'll focus on is the bright orange at the bottom. That's Wellington City. And you can see that at that points, it's been trending around about 10-15% lower than normal levels. The likes of Lower Hutt, which is the dark blue line that trends across the top here, it's doing a lot better, and it's because people who might have a job in Wellington aren't going into the office that much more. Certainly, if I zoom in a bit more and smooth things out, you can see those trends quite clearly. You've got Christchurch, Auckland and Wellington all sitting below the 0% line running through here, and you've got the other areas, the likes of Hamilton, Waipark, Selwyn and Lower Hutt all trending above. It is definitely a shift that's moving through that work from home element. And that's reinforced by some of the internal migration numbers we've seen across the country, the likes of where people were living a year ago, if they were living already in New Zealand, where the net ins and outs were. You can see the strongest elements around some of our major urban centres. So Auckland is moving up to Northern or down to the Waikato, Coromandel. Hamilton, again, moving out a little bit further. Tauranga is an exception for the metro rule. They've also got quite limited space, so it's likely that trend will reverse. Similarly, the likes of Palmerston North, Wellington and Christchurch all pushing out a bit further. You can see the Westland district here not quite as much of an outflow as for neighbouring areas as well. So a bit of a shift, a bit of a change in trend as we've moved through with those population numbers. Now, supply chain issues we continue to hear are major concerns across the country. And everyone I talk to seems to be of the view that they will be here for a while, and that's certainly my professional advice as well, is that anyone that tells you that one's fixed anytime soon is kidding themselves. At the moment, we were optimistic, if you will, overly optimistic as it turns out, that this might be done by September, December this year. It seems like it will roll for another 12 months, if not maybe 24. It's quite a long haul that we seem to be into. Big shift appears to be very much like someone who slowed down on the motorway going 100 down to 20. All the cars are backing up further. It's very hard to have the right containers in the right places across New Zealand and that is starting to hurt, or at least put limits on our economic recovery, because we're not able to get some stuff in that we're needing to actually, produce our goods and services. But just as importantly, as we can't actually export out quite as much. And I hear that one of the factories down in South Canterbury recently was turned off for about 12 days. There's no space to move stuff to. So there's definitely concerns growing there. Our expectation is that will make prices spike later this year in terms of consumer prices. Interestingly, everyone I talk to says that prices are higher, and all of the official data shows that there's not too much going on, which I find confusing, to be honest with you. I have a feeling that part of it is compositional, that when they measure prices, some of it comes down to what you can get and when. Classic example is that the price of electronics, according to Stats NZ, never goes up, even though my iPhone gets more expensive every second year that I buy it. And that's because on a quality adjusted metric, the iPhone I get today is better than the iPhone I would have bought last year, and therefore when you quality adjust it, the price has gone down. So it's a computational issue, if you will, not an actual pricing element. So overall, we're still hearing massive price increases. And this graph here demonstrates why. If we look at the Freightos Baltic Index, which is a sort of container index, the prices have increased massively over the last year. So the dark blue line is sort of what we had over the 12 months of April 2020. See, relatively flat. After that, it's risen from 1,500 to over 4,000. Now, I last updated this graph at the end of April. I've been reliably informed by one of my economists over the last week that after plateauing throughout the start of this year, which was reassuring, the index is now headed up to 5,000 over May. So we've continued to see a real push on prices there. And there's two struggles, right? It's one, things are more expensive. So that's a dollars and cents concern. But the second one is that even if you had all the money in the world, sometimes you just can't get stuff in around. So there's sort of a quantity issue as well that we're seeing emerging on that front. When we look at the different distributional hits, overall, again, we've seen the economy in a better position than we might have thought. That's not, that's quite an important point to make, and I certainly don't want to talk the economy down too much because we've had a relatively good run of it. But we're also seeing still some parts of the economy not doing all that well. We know that particularly young people have been hard hit by the pandemic, and that is a concern that we're seeing across the country, is that young people who got hit as well during the GFC are finding it difficult to get back into jobs. What you'll see from these numbers nationally was that the number of people over the age of 30 who are in jobs now sitting, a good, 24,000 higher than a year before. Great encouraging signs. For young people, though, you've got 12,000 fewer jobs. So it's not that we're not regaining jobs, it's that there's a slowdown for young people getting back into their areas. We also know that different groups in our communities are not doing quite as well. Again, across the country, we're seeing that Māori unemployment remains quite high, although it has, if you will, stabilised, thankfully. But the likes of Pacifica unemployment heading higher. Overall, you can see just that quite large bulk of Māori unemployment relative to the national average and to the European average. Again, speaks to the need for more support to actually get this moving.
Is there any correlation for the Pacific peoples about regions in New Zealand, for example, Auckland and jobs?
Absolutely, yeah, and we're certainly seeing that Auckland's quite a good example there, with much softer job growth in other parts of the country. It's also the sorts of jobs that Māori and Pacifica often do. They have been hit a little bit harder by the pandemic, often lower skilled jobs, which were some of the first out. That has been a bit of a struggle to get them moving ahead again. We've also seen that there's been a big shift, and likely a sustained shift, in our migration flows. We're not expecting net migration comes back to the 60,000 plus that we usually had at pre-pandemic. And certainly we've seen that over the past, I think, 3-4 years, an average of 6,000 people, net migrants coming into the country each month, down to less than 600 over the last few while. Now, I mean, look, that's what happens when you close borders. I mean, that's clear. The government, though, is making it also clear that they expect to be making some quite large changes to migration settings. Big speech about it recently that told us absolutely nothing, which was rather disappointing. But the government is seemingly making some larger changes, or making some substantial noises about larger changes when it comes to the migration track. Now, what I think the important thing here is that we are seeing businesses who have been reliant more on skilled migrants coming in from overseas for a while. The government, though, doesn't seem to have divorced the short-term and the long-term impacts of change in migration focus. Over the longer term, there's an ability for businesses, for local regions, similar, to start creating a much stronger talent pipeline of local workers. In the next few years, there's not that ability. You can't just magic up a few more workers for some of these skilled roles. So we are concerned that some of our businesses across the country will be hit quite hard by continued labour shortages or skill shortages in niche areas. And it's also interesting to see who or who doesn't get an MIQ spot at the moment. The government has opened up some more, particularly for construction, but I haven't heard anyone getting VIP access at the Wiggle spot yet. Now, COVID has been a big shift and has certainly diverted almost all of our attention over the last year, but we are seeing some of our older issues re-emerge. Now, this is not quite as important for the West Coast specifically, but I do think it's important to profile what we're seeing across the country. That housing focus, much more important than COVID in a sense. Over the summer period, I can tell you now that I had no conversations about how hard a hit COVID was providing to the economy. I did have everyone asking about interest rates, when to buy a house and where to get in. So there is still huge amounts of interest in that area, and I've said to become a house that pays more. That's certainly true. I've met no one this year who earned more than a house did last year. So if you know anyone, let me know, because it's quite a concerning trend in the sense that if I return myself into brick and mortar, I'd have better earning potential. We are seeing, though, again across the country, a shift in where people and where particularly local government are putting their focus. Quite a considerable increase in denser dwellings. When I say denser, I don't mean skyscraper apartment blocks. I'm talking more townhouses here. A lot of that being led out of Auckland with the unitary plan from 2016. But every council I speak to is doing some work either on a district plan, a spatial plan, or incorporating the latest national policy statement. So there is a shift towards densification, not to the degree, again, that we're sort of creating massive town slums or anything like that, but it's just a little bit closer together, a focus on trying to bring down the cost of building given how high it has become. At the moment, we're building enough for our current population growth, and a lot of that's because, well, we don't have a huge amount of population growth with that net migration coming out. But you'll see there's quite a while here when we look at our components of underlying demand across the country where we didn't build enough relative to previous times. So we are seeing at the moment we're still catching up on the housing shortage. What is interesting is we've seen that house prices across the country have risen quite strongly, and so outside of even the major urban centres, we've seen quite a bit of interest. I know even the likes, I think, of here on the coast, you've seen quite an increase, 20% or something over the last year in house values. So there's still quite a bit of momentum across the country. Government's making some big plays, some big changes in that housing space. There is a feeling that we could see quite a considerable flattening in house price growth. That could mean that for some of our regions, you see sort of having gone from Speedy Gonzales very quick rises, possibly the other direction, quite a swift decline or slowdown rather in house price growth, and possibly a decline for those markets that might have sort of overshot or overrun. We're also expecting that though the infrastructure spending keeps moving forward. We've seen local government doing a fair bit of this over the last year and committing to much more with the LTPs at the moment. Government dragging the chain, big promises, lots of press releases, absolutely no execution or very struggling execution. We've seen the shovel-ready projects which have been much more difficult to get moving, and just as importantly, we've also seen that the government's renegotiating or reconsidering its New Zealand upgrade program. Now, NZUP wasn't supposed to get going really until 2023-24, so if they can't even get their cost estimates right for major projects out in a few years' time, we do struggle a little bit with their ability to execute some of their plans in the near future. And look, the conversation we had before, Richard, around MB and similar, there is a capacity and capability constraint in central government at the moment around their ability to get stuff going. Part of it's because I don't think they've resourced themselves properly. The other part, though, is because there is a lot they're doing at the moment. They've turned on a magnet under the beehive to centralise a lot of services. That's taking a lot of consultants and a lot of manpower. And all of this housing stuff is important because we've seen a massive increase in the state housing waitlist. And you can see there that since about 2000 or 2002 odd, we've seen no real change in the number of people on state housing waitlist until about 2016, sitting static at about 5,000 odd on the priority list, and then spiking to about 22,000. That's a pretty major issue, and that there is what will happen if our rents go further up as well. It won't be that you sort of see any major changes in terms of average rents. We are concerned though that those on lower incomes will be pushed out of their market rental property and state housing waitlists. All right, let's turn our attention now a little bit more locally. Infometrics provided council with some forecasts based on our October 2020 forecast, so a little bit out of date in terms of the pure forecast, but the relativities and the directions are certainly still true, and if anything, I guess, providing a bit of upside risk. But let's go through the trends, and then we'll take some much broader questions, brief overview of what we'll look at, those employment figures, a bit of population, tourism generally, and then a bit of regional and local data. So overall, we're expecting a much swifter and harder hit to Westland's employment numbers, particularly around that tourism focus, and we've seen that rolling through, and I'll show you some numbers later that highlight that tourism area, particularly accommodation and food services, has taken a blow, particularly down around the glacier areas. At the same time, I guess we could moderate a fair bit of that drop in a sense, coming through with a much swifter return and rise in some of those healthcare and public sector roles, alongside the likes of construction and manufacturing. So in a sense, we could dampen these peaks a little bit because we've seen a bit more near-term strength. We knew there was going to be a downside. That was clear from the tourism hit. We weren't quite sure of how much upside there was, but that spending from government more generally, without any targeting, has sort of just generally provided a bit more foundation underneath us. You'll see there that sort of in line with our expectations for where international tourism trends generally, that there is support for employment to fill in that hole relatively quickly as we move through that forecast period. There is going to be a revival in job numbers moving forward. And we've seen on the coast as well that that's been quite a challenging trend in a sense that when, depending on where coal prices have moved, we saw quite a few people that have moved further up the coast when there's opportunities up there, and then when coal prices haven't been performing quite as well, and there's been a much stronger tourism focus, again more of a flow into this part of the coast. So again, quite an important dynamic there in terms of how both of those play out, and the resumption of the likes of tourism is likely to benefit there.
Are you still predicting a drop in the next year despite the holding?
In a sense, I guess the worry is that we're still hearing that a lot of people have battled through the summer, and there's concern still that there might be further job losses to come. We're also not sure how many of the boosted jobs that we've seen are sort of permanent jobs or sustainable jobs. Certainly across the economy, we're seeing an increase in the likes of more precarious works and fixed term, temporary, casual employment, but also if there's momentum. So for the likes of construction and the public sector and health, once we've finished with our vaccinators, do we need that higher workforce? Certainly at the level that it's at. Part of for at least healthcare, the answer is likely yes. We've got an aging population, and so there is a need to provide more workers. But on the whole, I'm a little bit worried that those jobs don't necessarily stick around. And if tourism does take longer to recover generally, then these forecasts could well come to pass.
It's quite a big drop percentage-wise, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I think that's the thing, is that I think we can certainly moderate that drop given the experience we've had over the last year and our expectations for a much softer hit to job losses now. And I think, in fact, if you look at that dark blue line for New Zealand, our latest forecast has pulled that up quite a bit and smoothed the line. It seems like, in a sense, we were expecting, and you can see this in both parts of the graph, we're expecting a hard hit to start with, and then it took the revival a bit longer to come through. It seems like, particularly in that healthcare and public sector space, alongside construction, that resurgence has come through much swifter, so it's been able to balance that out. The question is, can we maintain that momentum going forward? If we look at the different sort of sectors across both history and into the future, you can see some interesting trends there. The major grower of the last wee while has been in the manufacturing sector, generally focused around food and beverage production and similar, and that highlights the importance of the primary sector. You will note the primary sector down the bottom there with a bit of a reduction in job numbers. That's not too surprising. It's a trend we're seeing across the country. The primary sector is an important earner and an important spender for the local economy, but it doesn't itself employ huge numbers. Provides that very solid base though of activity and gets spending out across the other areas. You can also see, particularly for Westland, that growth coming through in the likes of the tourism-related industry of accommodation and food services, a little bit moving through as well in transport, postal and warehousing. Part of that in terms of logistics required here on the coast, and again, partially around the tourism activity we've seen. So that'll include your flight operators, similar down in the Glacier area.
What's your jump this year? It's forecast.
It's forecast over the next decade. And so part of that is very much the resumption in activity as well in tourism stuff. In terms of population growth, and I think the important thing to underscore here is that compared to other forecasts, i.e. Stats NZ's forecast of population growth, we take into account what we think is going to happen to employment. And that's probably the major difference. And we saw that Southland's quite a good example of this. Back in 2006 and 2013, we were forecasting an increase in Southland's population because there was employment growth, because we were expecting some all right jobs activity. Stats NZ was picking quite a drop, and that was just based on their sort of natural long-term forecast. But again, without recognising where employment and job numbers were heading or not, meant that the Stats NZ forecasts weren't particularly optimistic or realistic for Southland. A similar sort of thing here for particularly Westland that we're expecting again, that resumption in international tourism continues to pull people in. And it's important, I think, to reflect that it's not just, if you will, tourist workers themselves, but again, more people who might be working on the coast as we move forward to support tourism also means that they will spend their money locally, and so there's that need for wider services to support them. And you can see that into the future with a tick up in the population. In terms of what's driving that, we're expecting that births and deaths remain broadly relatively flat. In a sense, not too much change. To be fair, if either of those figures changes dramatically, there's something going wrong either in the modelling or in society. Interestingly, we haven't seen a big post-lockdown boom in births, and I say that because it was something we were thinking might happen. People cooped up indoors for a long time. We've seen it in previous downturns. What is interesting though is, and what seems to be the trend, is that one, as I've heard from a number of parents, if you already had one kid, no one seemed to think that it was a good idea after 4.5 weeks to have any more. But just as importantly is that we generally see in an economic downturn, people are not quite as keen to think about further children. That uncertainty often means that people are much more concerned about their own future, and therefore if it's time to think about further children or not. You'll see as well a bit of a shift there in terms of net migration. Now that's from both sources, both overseas and from other parts of the country. Taking you back to that map I showed you a fair few slides back, you can see trends there in terms of, again, that population boost will be supporting more of that. You will notice a little bit in terms of the birth numbers ticking up a touch as we move towards the end of the forecast period. What that is that the boost in job numbers coming through in the 2020s generally means that, again, you'll be bringing more people into the population. More of those people will be of childbearing age. So generally we're expecting a slight uptick there. I mean, it's not much, if we actually gave you the raw figures there, we're talking not a huge spike, but a little bit more of a shift there. Over time, that population growth coupled with the likes of an ageing population means we're expecting the number of households to increase as well. We know that as the population ages, people generally shift into smaller household units, and the classic example there is that if you've got mum, dad and 2 kids, eventually as everyone grows up, the 2 kids need their own house, probably 1 house each, and mum and dad still need a house, maybe a slightly smaller 2-bedroom or something. And so you've gone from 1 house to 3 houses in that 1 family unit. Tempering that a little bit in terms of why the numbers don't just spike massively is that affordability concerns also means that across New Zealand we're not seeing quite as much of a shift in that occupancy rate. People are sort of living together in different ways, shapes and forms for a longer period, either multi-generational families, people who are flatting together or living in shared accommodation for a while longer because of cost, and people who might not be leaving home or having slightly different arrangements there. Now, important for particularly Westland district in the context of the coast generally, is that importance of tourism. 40% in 2019 of all the jobs in the district were tourism related, compared to, I think, off the top of my head, about 10% for New Zealand. So you can see quite a different shift there, and 65% from international tourist visitors. Now, we've talked before about how important domestic activity has been. We have seen quite a good resumption in that. I guess the question will be, what does that look like going forward when we have international tourism resume? That also means that Kiwis will be able to visit across the country. So how do we lock in some of that domestic tourism spend? And importantly, how do our tourism operators also focus on two different markets? Because they do spend quite differently, as I'll show you in a moment. We've talked about it, but look, to give you the numbers, we have seen a good boost in domestic spend there. You can see that those levels over the last few months and this is for the entire region to get this monthly detail, are standing up quite a bit stronger. However, you'll also note that it hasn't been quite enough to fill that international tourism deficit yet. So better and certainly important to see, but again, some organisations and groups still doing relatively tough. Now, if we look at where visitors spend their money, there is quite a different set here. First thing to remember with this graph is I'm showing you the percentage of what a traditional domestic tourist and a traditional international tourist would spend in Westland District. What I'm not showing you is how much they spend. Internationals, of course, spend a fair bit more. But you can see that New Zealanders generally have a much cheaper travel focus, again, spending less than the average international on the likes of accommodation and even food in a sense. You know, mum and dad going to pick up a hot chicken and a few buns and some coleslaw from the supermarket rather than going out too many times, or grabbing a get fish and chips ahead of going to a restaurant, spending a lot more of their money on an actual activity, in this case often flying to the glacier or similar, with their other public transport, quite a strong element of spend there. And that's true for a lot of other parts of the country. We see that people are generally, New Zealanders rather, generally quite focused on experience-based activities, less so on cultural-based activities, and that's a little bit different from international tourists. Again, Rotorua, a good example there, where going into the forest and similar is quite good fun, but people who are going there to understand more about the Māori culture, not going quite as well with domestic tourists moving ahead. If we look at how spending's been trending locally, and again, trying to zoom in and look at the relativities across the economy, you can see that big hit from international tourism for Westland District across the summer period particularly. You can see two things. One, that earlier back here, there was a good boost of domestic tourism and not as much of a loss from international tourism. Similarly, we're getting into the period now where there's not quite as much activity baseline anyway, and so there's still activity, there's not as much of a drop in activity. I think there's a balance there between there is still still domestic tourists who are supporting local operators, but also just generally lower spending comparatively, so not quite as much of a drop that you might experience. You will see though that that's quite different again from the likes of Grey and Buller in terms of activity. Again, that focus on tourism generally for Western District has meant that it's been a hard hit. Again, looking at it, it's going to be down in the southern part of the district that's been feeling that hit the most. Now, I showed you those numbers before in terms of our total expectations for international tourism. I thought I'd break it down as well in terms of Australia and the rest of the world. You can see that Australia, we do expect it to get going, hopefully as we move forward. We've got the bubble now and it is shifting, but it is sort of still a slow slog, and then that international tourism activity from the rest of the world getting going a little bit more towards 2023 in terms of stronger numbers moving ahead. So we're a bit more pessimistic about that outlook, and the big one for me is that it took us a year from COVID hitting New Zealand and us locking down to get a bubble with Australia, our dearest neighbour, and far cheaper for me normally to fly to Australia from Wellington than it is to go back up home to Whangarei. If it takes us that long to get into the Australian market, and even then we haven't seen as swift of a resumption we might have hoped, we do struggle to see just how quickly we also reopen up to the globe. Just as importantly, we don't see the government has a plan for it. We don't. I genuinely couldn't tell you at the moment how we reopen up. Do we do the likes of a big, 75% of the population is vaccinated and therefore we'll all go? Any flights are welcome. Do we do green zone countries? Do we do a few more bubbles? Do we have vaccine passports? No one in government seems to have done that thinking or is willing to share it too publicly. In the last 2 weeks, we've heard the Prime Minister start to make a few more statements about that thinking, but again, not enough for businesses or ourselves to plan too much on. And Treasury, in terms of being government's-led economic advisors and knowing where policy expectations are moving, have a similar sort of view at the moment. Given how well the rest of the globe is starting to cope with COVID, there's an upside risk that we do get going better, like the US, of course, recovering quite swiftly. Also a strong downside risk that we don't actually get COVID all that well under control. India is out of control at the moment in terms of COVID cases, and Taiwan, after being the best performer for over a year, now seeing exponential growth in their daily case numbers. And the worry is that until we get vaccines moving across the world at pace, and at the moment, the Economist intelligence unit expects that it's 2024 before the entire world gets the COVID vaccine. The worry is that that long lag period means that the virus has longer to mutate into something that could well whip around the world further. Generally, on the coast, we are seeing that that strong primary sector is certainly still helping. That activity is holding up and providing further support and foundation for jobs, and that's been a constant one as we've moved across. Further up the coast, we're seeing that stronger hard commodity prices, coal and similar, are also propping up things and certainly providing a bit more support. There's been more construction activity and certainly more activity generally by some of the PGF funding that started to roll out. It took a bit of time, but we are starting to get that. I know from a former Northlander that I knew that there's something like even the White Bay facility, I think, which is great, which is starting to get going. So again, a bit more support coming there from government, but challenges around further execution and certainly the speed of execution as we move forward. There are worries certainly from some quarters around the outlook for employment and population, particularly given the trends we've seen on the coast in recent times. Given the importance of the natural environment to this region, what the government does or doesn't do could have some quite important consequences in terms of freshwater regulations and energy activity and even sustainable tourism to a point, depending on exactly where the government gets to with that thinking. But overall, we have seen that the coast actually has a relatively resilient and flexible population. Again, those shifts over time in terms of what industries are performing well and people who are still willing to come through here. The more I talk to people, the more you start to feel that there's a strong loyalty element as well around our regional economies. Businesses rather, who kept themselves operating last year and keeping locals employed, locals then feeding back and ensuring that they're spending local to keep those businesses operating. So there's still a firm foundation under all of that. Last few bits, I promise then we'll get into some questions. We've seen that our quarterly figures are still indicating a relatively tough hit to the economy. Again, it's no surprise given that loss of international tourism, but let's be clear, it could still be a lot worse. In terms of total spending across the last 12 months, tourism spending is down nearly 45% in Westland District compared to a 17-odd% decline. So, and I think that's what we were talking about earlier, that some businesses will be doing all right, other businesses really struggling. It's not quite a tourism or not story, it's where you sit within that tourism sector. We've seen a strong rise in non-residential consent values, and again, that's going to be supporting construction activity alongside still firm activity in the housing space. Given the cheap cost of housing relative to the rest of the country, there's certainly interest in activity here locally. You'll see that the likes of registrations down the bottom of the screen there, not quite as much of a dip, at least relative to the New Zealand average, considering how the rest of the economy's gone. What that highlights to me is that registrations are quite a good example of business and consumer confidence. If households are still confident enough about the economy, they'll make their second biggest purchase in life, and that's the car. And similarly, from a business point of view, if you feel like you're all right at the moment, you may well continue to invest. So although the numbers are down, you might have expected to see a much wider drop given where spending activity and general tourism trends have moved. And that's partially because we have seen still a good jump in job numbers locally. There has been a good shift there. If we look at the areas, and this is specific for Westland, I can't break it down into what parts of the district, but it's no surprises in a sense that you'd expect to see a lot of this drop of 180 odd jobs, I think it was, from accommodation and food services coming again from the southern part of the district. The other end of the spectrum, though, the likes of health, public administration, and even retail and manufacturing activity bringing bringing in a few more jobs. So still a fairly firm foundation. It is still a tough period, but at the same time, things could have been a lot worse. And I guess it's ensuring or working to ensure how we lock in some of those gains of domestic tourists and similar, and what that means for the continued sort of evolution of the West Coast and Western District's economic structure will be important, because we are seeing big shifts. We are seeing, different industries moving at very different paces, some recovering fast, some recovering, some actually, continuing to go worse. And there are concerns that we're certainly not out of the woods yet, but overall, a firm foundation of activity. After 54 minutes of me rambling on, I'm going to be quiet for a second. I'm very happy to take any and all questions that I may or may not be able to try and answer.
Any questions from Brad?
Sound silence. You're all asleep after today.
Sorry, I was pulling out through.
I've got a quick question. You talked earlier on about births and deaths. Has there been any impact on household breakdown of that period?
And what's it in terms of
divorces and that kind of stuff?
Nothing too concrete, although to be fair, those numbers are always difficult to pull together. Part of it, and I say this because I recently became a marriage celebrant, so the nerd in me decided to look at these numbers. So I'm sort of glad that I did this, given your question. We've seen that, of course, marriage numbers are quite a bit down relative to where they normally would be, just because people have been able to get together. Some people certainly putting off formalising some of their arrangements because COVID sort of made things a lot more uncertain, and there's more pressing issues for money. On the divorce side, you're certainly hearing more stories of people who might be have been struggling already, and COVID might well have been the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of activity. Nothing concrete in the numbers or anything firm to point towards, and I say that because I don't think we're expecting a rising tsunami of divorces or similar, but I think general trends around sort of more fractured and dislocated communities is a trend we're seeing across the country. Part of that as well possible because we are seeing, in a sense, more isolation. People working from home and sort of spending more time at home as a shift, which on some hands might be good, on others does mean that you're a lot more isolated. You're staring at a screen for most of the day and not having as much human interaction. So there are concerns around mental health and that across not only New Zealand, but across the world. Hopefully in New Zealand that is limited a touch. Over in the likes of the UK, we've seen quite a steep rise in mental health concern, but a lot of that's been because people have been locked up and had no option to go out and had COVID as a constant present threat. In New Zealand, the shift towards working from home hasn't necessarily been because you couldn't go anywhere else, it's because it was an easy, worthwhile option, and you were still able to socialise differently if you wanted to. So certainly still a risk there though.
Brad. Sorry, Brad, Richard Benton here. Great presentation. Thank you. I've learned such a lot. I'm busy taking photographs of all your slides. Hey, you had one slide there called Building Up, Not Out. And I was interested to see that retirement villages or dwellings was pretty flat from 2021 through to 2025. And I was thinking that aging population, isn't there going to be a need for more retirement dwellings? So can you maybe I've just been interested around that really as to how you've managed to scope that out.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, one of the interesting ones, I think, you're right in the sense that we will need more. I guess what we're seeing at the moment is there's sort of a steady pipeline of retirement villages and retirement units that are coming online. So it's in a sense just sort of natural progression without any big bumps. We certainly know that during COVID, a number of retirement village operators put their plans on ice for a period until it was clear what was happening in the construction market, but a lot of them are getting going. So those numbers there are running total. So, there's still growth over time in terms of the total number of units available. It's just the trend in them is relatively steady in a sense. And I say that relative to, say, townhouses, where the feeling is that you'll have a big boost of spending and investment and building of those. And then eventually, because, we start to build into our undersupply, we don't need quite as many going forward. So overall, the number of retirement units available in the country will go up. It's just that the trend in their building structure will sort of be relatively constant. So I guess what I'm saying is we're not expecting that all of a sudden all of the retirement homes start to get built in 2023. It's a nice staggered throughout time.
Okay, thank you.
Brett, I've got one question. Can you extrapolate those figures? You probably have already done it, so that we can look in 2023-24 what our actual employment figures will be, our housing needs will be?
Yes, yeah. So all of that is I think contained in the documents that we would have provided through the council in terms of those expectations around household numbers, employment figures, and all of that. I don't have them directly to hand at the moment, but we will have numbers back on, and I can talk. I'll make sure that our economist can send through a few bullet points as well on that if need be.
That'd be great, because there's a fantastic amount of information, and it looks pretty jolly positive to me.
Well, certainly, I think that's the thing over time, and this is the challenge that we often find, particularly with population and employment projections, is that everyone and we're humans, we naturally look short term. Population things don't change incredibly swiftly, which is, like I said, if you see the births and deaths numbers that actually show any real variation in the short term, something's gone wrong with the numbers, because people naturally have children. You know, there's just a bulk of the population who are naturally going to have children because they're at that stage in life, and naturally people are going to die because they're at that time of life as well. So those trends are sort of, you know, relatively well locked in, particularly in New Zealand with an ageing population. We're sort of seeing a key shift. So, but generally, I think, and I think this is the challenge, right, is that the coast has always been relatively resilient. It has certainly had challenges and remains more isolated than a lot of other parts of the country relative to where the major urban centres sit. But there's also a feeling, if you will, certainly from my position, that previously our urban centres, our metro centres, were drivers of economic growth of the country. And it's now being much more rebalanced towards more of our provincial regional centres. Those urban areas, again, not going to do quite as well from the shift to work from home and similar. And again, we're seeing people are much more engaged in parts of the provincial and primary sectors, because that is where the jobs are, that's where the money is to be made. So I'm still relatively confident about our regional economies. I think the coast is no exception there. But yes, I'll get back to send through some notes. That'd be great.
Any further questions?
Last question from me, Brad. Looks like tourism is going to be a really slow burn to get back to. Well, I see by 2026, we're still not going to be up to the 4 million or just under 4 million that we were in 2019. So if you had a tourism business in the glacier country, which is geographically isolated and not near any large population base, and you saw those figures, what would your advice be?
Yeah, well, I guess part of that comes back into how do you lock in that domestic trend, because I think we are starting to see people that are still keen. The difficulty, and this is one of the challenges as well, Richard, with the likes of the drive-based location stuff, is that part of it as well is that people want to often in New Zealand at least go on sort of short, repeatable trips. And I say that because if I'm an Aucklander, I might want to go up to Northland or to the Coromandel for a weekend away. But it's not necessarily that I will go from Auckland to, say, Kaikoura every second weekend. For a lot of people, it's a bit more of a once and done thing. You go and see the whales and that's it. And I say that because I feel like we need to have a think, and look, I don't necessarily have, I certainly don't have all the answers here. I'm an economist, which means you probably shouldn't trust much what I say. No, I'm kidding. But I say that because I do wonder if, particularly in the tourism sector, for example, we need to have a conversation around how do we get more repeatable trips happening from domestic tourists? Because I don't think it's a sustainable option to hope that you necessarily say get a whole bunch of people that go into the glaciers and have a helicopter ride every second weekend. It may well, for a lot of families, be something they do very infrequently. And so it says, what are the other offerings that can be provided in those areas that are more repeatable and that we can do differently? Now, for somewhere like the coast, we've got to recognise that on the whole, it's not going to be the place that you get lots of repeatable tourists and sort of high frequency. The difference is you want to shift, in a sense, from low frequency to medium frequency activity. How do you get people coming in, you know, a few months of the year, you know, making, I guess, a tradition of coming over and having a look at the glaciers and, I don't know, touring around and doing a bit of a tramp and bits and pieces. So I feel like there's a focus on how do we, I guess, attract and retain some of those domestic travellers in the first instance. And that will require a bit of a shift in what products we offer and where our focus goes in terms of marketing. Because I don't think it's a big marketing campaign of come and see the West Coast. It's come and see the West Coast again and again and again. like I say, don't have sort of all of the solutions there, but I think that is going to be one of the key challenges. The second one is going to be how you attract those international tourists back once they start to come, because every man and his dog, funnily enough, is going to want to compete for those tourist numbers, and that to me says that one, there's got to be a strong marketing campaign for sure, but two, I think there's got to be good, strong sort of transport linkages and logistics thinking that goes in ahead of time. You know, is there the potential to hook up with some of the local agencies in Canterbury for bringing people across to the coast? You know, what's the entire sort of destination plan for this entire region? Because again, it is difficult, if you will, if you've got a few Bombardier Q300s flying into Hokitika a few times a day, that's still a limitation in terms of actually getting people over here. So what is that sort of flow, and what does a pathway look like for tourists to come into the coast? I think it's going to be a sort of the area I would be interested in focusing on if I was in the sector.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we are looking to reposition Glacier Country at the moment. We're doing some projects around that. But the key is our West Coast airport that we've got in Hokitika, I believe. The 5.5-hour drive is a barrier. Yet if we could fly people directly in, charter planes or whatever in from Auckland or Wellington, we're bringing the population to us. And maybe that's probably something we need to be a bit bigger and bolder about trying to explore. Certainly if we want to get short-term business into our region. That's great. You're exactly on the same pathway that we've been thinking.
Oh, good. And look, I must admit, and look, I'll freely admit that I'm a pretty poor New Zealand tourist, because that drive, I mean, look, part of my travels yesterday were heavily disrupted by some of the Canterbury issues, but I was keen myself to drive down to Franz Josef and have a look around, and just in terms of timings, haven't been able to make it work before my other travels. So I think, you know, if I make the trip again, which I will, that's the sort of thing where I think I'll plan that one much more directly in terms of how to come down. I guess a question though for you guys in the room, like, look, I'm a Wellington economist that sits in the ivory tower and within the Beltway. How does any of this hit, and sort of, are there any things that we're missing? And I'm particularly interested in that sort of tourism feel. I mean, is there things that we're not seeing, hearing, or thinking about? And more generally, are there other trends that you think are important that we should be aware of? Because I'd hate to come here and try and tell you how to, you know, how it is happening locally, and then sort of leave without any real feedback. So feel free to give it to me, warts and all, if you've got anything.
I think you're fairly well on the money. I mean, if I look at so the holiday park sector, which I'll probably know a little bit more about than some of the others, what we are seeing throughout the country is that places that are within an hour and a half drive of the metro area are doing really well. Those within a 3-hour drive are doing okay. Those further afield are really, really struggling. And so it's interesting, if I look at up in the Nelson-Marlborough area, a lot of those people are going, well, actually, instead of going to Wellington and the Lower North Island for my holiday, I'm going to pop back down into the Buller. And so a lot of Buller's tourism seems to be driven from people within that region. Christchurch people tend to be going closer afield to the likes of Hamner Springs and a little bit down to South Canterbury, more than they are coming across here. One of the challenges we look at marketing the region is people's behaviours. So what we find is it's easier to get Canterbury people to plan a trip, but if you can get someone from Wellington or Auckland to plan a trip, they will come. People from Canterbury will look at the weather on Friday and go, yeah, right. And so what we find is that the people from Auckland and Wellington, once they've planned their trip, are going to come. People from Christchurch, to be fair, they'll probably still come, but just they won't come that weekend. And so the impact on accommodation businesses is harder for Canterbury than it is for
fluctuating so much.
Yeah, because you're getting a lot of cancellations.
Is it fair as well, though? I mean, just thinking of the sort of geography, then you've got sort of, like, say, Nelson Tasman, who can come down shortish trip, if you will, to Buller. Yep. You've got Christchurch, which you can go over to Hamner, but sort of another step again to come over, even if you go North Pass over, you know, to here, and then coming over Arthurs is still quite a bit of a drive. So, and even if you come up via Queenstown, I mean, it's still quite how long would it be from the likes of Queenstown to 6 hours? Yeah. Okay.
So a lot of them are coming into Hearts. We're seeing, like, it's fascinating talking to Hearts businesses who have been consistently more upbeat than those in Franz and Fox. Would you say that's fair, Richard? Sorry, you're muted.
Yes, I think I probably would. Yeah.
that's good to know. It's just in terms of we're still trying to figure out. I mean, tourism is the constant question, you know, that we're getting, everyone else is getting. So it's good to sort of try and connect a few more of the dots in terms of how people are trending.
Anything else, Brad?
No, nothing else from me. I just found the presentation exceptionally interesting, Brad. I like facts and figures. I'm an economist myself. That was what I was trained in, so I really enjoy that stuff. So thank you very much. Appreciated sharing that information.
Oh, awesome. Well, look, thank you very much for having me. It's wonderful to be here on the coast finally after talking about it for a long time. I've put my money where my mouth is a bit more now. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you here as a domestic tourist. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.